Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to speak to you tonight. It's extra wonderful because for the first time, I believe, this year, or at least in the last few months, I'm able to speak to you this evening, and yet light is still streaming in the windows, which tells me that we're getting closer to the good time of year, as far as I'm concerned. Moses, the name that you see above my head there, is an extremely important figure in the biblical text. In the narrative of the history of God's people, Moses' name stands out above most others. After all, he's the man who led the people out of Egypt and parted the Red Sea. He's the one who brought down the law. It's called the Law of Moses, who delivered the Ten Commandments along with many others to them so that they would know what God wanted them to do. He's the one who led them through the many years in the wilderness to bring them to the land that God had promised their forefathers so many years ago. And of course, he doesn't disappear just because we finish the old law, just because we get to the to the start of the New Testament. Within the pages of the New Testament, his name shows up another 79 times. He's referred to again and again. Jesus speaks the name Moses with respect. In Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 through 3, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, says Jesus. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. So there's these guys going around doing what Jesus does not approve of, hypocrites as he calls them. But insofar as these men are still teaching the law of Moses, continuing the role of Moses, what he did during his life, as long as they're still doing that, you respect them for that role. Later on, again, with the Pharisees coming up to Jesus in order to test him in Mark chapter 10, they said, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They're coming to Jesus, and Jesus returns to them, "Why are you asking me for a second opinion? The words of Moses are very clear, and they are authoritative on this subject. What does Moses tell you to do? That's what you should do." And of course, Jesus then is able to go on and give them some background information on why Moses commanded them to do what he did, because he's God, of course, and knows the reasoning behind the rules. But because of all these things, because of his prevalence in the scripture, his importance throughout history, I'm going to give some time for us to look at him, because we're not just going to be looking at Moses this lesson. This is going to be the first of 3 lessons where we look at the life of Moses. And conveniently, Moses' life is divided up into 3 distinct chunks for us by the Bible. If we look in Acts chapter 7, in the speech of Stephen, he recounts essentially the history of God's people leading up to Christ and why you should follow Christ because of all these things that led to him. And in giving a summary essentially of the life of Moses, first in Acts 7, verse 23, we see that when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And then 40 years after that, when Moses would have been 80. Now when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in a flame of fire in a bush, the classic burning bush that we know so well, that wonderful imagery. And in Deuteronomy 34, at the end of Moses' life, we're told that Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated. And so we have 40 years, 40 years, and 40 years, the divisions of Moses' life. Each division very different, each in a different place, each a very different time in Moses' life, where he grew, where he did different things, where he was in some ways a different person as we are different people as we go through the timeline of our own lives and change. So, we're going to begin in that first section, and in fact, for purposes of my lesson tonight, we're going to begin a little bit before that first section. What, in fact, is going on in the world before Moses is born? What world is he born into? Now, we know, of course, that Joseph, he of the coat of many colors, or the psychedelic dream coat, if you're of a certain era, brought his family into Egypt, that he saved them from famine in the land that they were in by taking them to Egypt. And there, for a number of generations, they prospered and multiplied, and that's the situation Exodus tells us about in its introduction. Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. And this is what we'd expect from the people of Israel, the children of Israel, because God had promised this of their fathers. When God first spoke to Abraham and said, I will bless your descendants, I will make them as the stars of the sky, I will make them as the sands on the beach, that there will be a mighty nation and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through them, that, well, this is God beginning the process of making that promise, that blessing, a reality to them. But while this was meant as a blessing to them from God, because God was backing them, we know that this was not seen as a great thing by everyone around. Exodus 1, verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, the Bible can mean a few different things when it uses the term know. On one hand, it can be the very literal version that we are most likely to use, I think, in our modern English language, of just maybe this Pharaoh had never heard the name Joseph, that Joseph had never come up, he didn't know who he was, he didn't know where all these children of Israel, these Hebrews, had come from, and so he's just ignorant. I think that's a less likely of the two options here, though. I think that the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, would have been very well educated. He would have known the history of his nation. He would have known his forefathers, what the previous kings had done, the decisions they had made, the struggles and the trials that they had faced in their reigns, and been educated in that so that when he received the crown, when he became the king, he would be able to make good choices and lead his people. And so I don't think that this Pharaoh did not know anything about Joseph. I think he didn't care about Joseph. The name Joseph weighed nothing in his heart, that Joseph didn't mean anything to him, and so the descendants of Joseph weren't the people who were descended from the one who saved Egypt from famine. They were just these foreigners, these almost invaders who had been here for so long, and he saw as a threat. And so when he sees these people, that's all he sees them as. Verses 9 and 10, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. Let's make wise plans for how to deal with this problem. What Pharaoh has here is an issue of perspective, because he's not looking to the past, doesn't have the full view of history in his mind. He sees the people of Israel in front of him, and they loom large. They're all he can see, so they look giant, they look dangerous, they look like a threat to his nation, to his rule. And so he feels like he has to do something about this existential threat that's in front of him, because his perspective is so narrow. So he reacts in fear. He tries to oppress them, tries to push them down to reduce their strength so that they're less of a giant in front of him for him to be fearful of. And we know that Pharaoh isn't the only one who can run into this problem. That in our lives we can lose perspective, we can have our view shrink, we can not remember what we need to remember, and then we can make short-sighted decisions based on that limited perspective. We know that the people of Israel, once Moses did lead them through to the promised land and they became a nation, were constantly struggling with that. They were constantly forgetting not their forefathers, but forgetting God himself. And he was constantly having to call them back. That's what many of the books of the prophets we have in the Old Testament are all about, is calling them to remember God, to come back, to get their perspectives in order again. Isaiah is one such prophet, and he records the words of God himself. We're reading in Isaiah chapter 51, verses 12 and 13, where God says, I am he who comforts you. This is who I am. Remember me, says God. Who are you that you are afraid of man who dies, of the Son of Man who is made like grass, and have forgotten the Lord, your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth? And you fear continually all the day because of the wrath of the oppressor, when he sets himself to destroy. And where is the wrath of the oppressor? God calling the people to remember him, to come back, to widen their view, to remember what they need to remember so that they can get back on the right track. Because, well, that's the positive part, is that, well, we might all sometimes fail in that way of having that limited perspective of not remembering the important things we need to remember, maybe forgetting our first love in God, that we can come back, we can have our view widened again and recover from that trip, from that failing. Now, Pharaoh, in trying to limit the people of Israel, trying to smash them down so that they're not a threat anymore, he fails in that effort. But that doesn't mean he's going to stop trying. We see him try and try again because Exodus 1:12, the more they were oppressed, the people of Israel, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. Pharaoh wasn't alone in his fear of them here, seeing them as this threat. And so Pharaoh is going to keep trying, keep using different tactics to oppress the people of Israel. And they're not going to work, and so he's going to have to change his tact, do something different. And he comes up with a new, worse way to be more direct about oppressing them, solving the Hebrew problem that he sees in front of him. And so he decides that he's going to force a choice onto two women. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, we're introduced to these two women. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. They're not important. You just let them keep going. Pharaoh has come up with a much more direct solution to what he sees as a population problem. Just kill the children, and then you won't have more adult Hebrews running around. Now, this isn't the last fearful tyrant we see take exactly this sort of tact. We know that in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 2, King Herod tries to do the same thing to kill the young boy Jesus, who he's heard about this king of the Jews coming who might be a threat to his rule. And when the wise men try to circumvent him and avoid telling him exactly where this young boy is, this king to be is, he decides, oh, well, I'll just kill all the boys. Anyone who might be this threat to me, I'll just get rid of them. Every single one, because my power is that important. My fear of losing what I have is that big in my sight. I'm going to take these extreme steps. Now, unfortunately, Herod is very successful in at least killing children, though we know that he doesn't catch Jesus, of course. But Pharaoh first is trying to send Shiphrah and Puah, and they're not these trained soldiers. They've got more of a crisis of conscience. They've got to weigh up this thing that's been put in front of them. On one hand, on one side of the scale, they're human women, right? They've got conscience, they've got morality, they've got, a normal choice to make there. They're midwives. They're women who have devoted their lives to helping mothers and their little babies to get through the very difficult, and especially in this time, very dangerous time of childbirth. They're women who are dedicated to life and being asked to kill. On the other hand, we have Pharaoh and the very real power, the very real authority, the very real danger that he poses to them. And so they have to weigh these things up in their lives of what they'll do when they're commanded to do this by Pharaoh. But luckily, it wasn't just them. There was a third party involved in the decision as well. Because we read in verse 17 of Exodus chapter 1 that the midwives feared God. And we know that often when the Bible is speaking about fear, it's speaking about a very deep, bone-deep respect and honor here. It's not just fear like we might have with Halloween coming up, a jump scare, right? This is something much deeper, much more intense, much more foundational to your understanding of the universe is our fear of God, our understanding of the wonderful might of God. And God makes a difference here in their decision. When weighing up the fear of man versus the fear of God, well, there's no real competition there. If we were to turn back to Isaiah chapter 51, right, God himself says, who are you that you are afraid of man who dies, right? Simple man, short-lived man, mortal man, to be afraid of him and have forgotten the Lord, your maker, the maker, in fact, of everything, right? Between these two things, which should you be more fearful of? Which should you hold in higher regard? Well, if anyone has their view right, their perspective correct, then the answer is obvious. Now, not being afraid of mortal man doesn't mean a mortal man can't cause you a whole lot of trouble. Doesn't mean that someone like Pharaoh, like a tyrant, can't in fact inflict grievous harm upon you. The midwives knew that. They knew the risks they were taking, and yet they lied to Pharaoh. They refused to kill the children and let them live. They do not kill one single child, despite being ordered to by the most powerful man in the land. And God sees their decision. He cares about their decision. He knows their decision. And so he does, in fact, reward them and protect them for making that decision, that choice in their lives. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families, so he blessed them with it. Bless them there and now, though we know in the end all things will be made right, all things will be made just one way or the other, even if the tyrants seem to get their way for a little while. At this point, after the midwives don't kill the children like he wanted them to, Pharaoh has failed 3 times in a row to oppress the people of Israel, the Hebrews. But Pharaoh's not playing baseball here. He's not out yet. He's going to try a 4th attempt, see if that one's a charm. He goes the Herod route. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile. But, again, you shall let every daughter live. At this point, Pharaoh has made his decision. In fact, he's doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down on that decision. He's not budging. It reminds us of the hardness of the heart later on of the Pharaoh that Moses has to deal with as an adult. The midwives have made their decisions, and they've stuck to their guns as well. And now it's time for individual Hebrew families to make their decisions about what to do. One such Hebrew family is introduced to us at the beginning of chapter 2 of Exodus. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. He was a fine child, a beautiful child, a lovely child in her eyes. And of course he is, because what mother doesn't think that? But this isn't just motherly favoritism going on here. God agrees with her. If we're to jump back to that speech from Stephen in Acts chapter 7 that we spoke about earlier, we can see that at this time, Acts 7:20, Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. Now we know that God doesn't judge beauty in the same way that we do. So what does it mean that this Moses, this baby, was beautiful in the sight of God? Well, if we turn over to 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, when Samuel is being tasked with God to go to one of the sons of Jesse to anoint him as the new king, Samuel gets quite confused about which one God is choosing. And God comes back to him with this. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." What was the article? Of course, you all read the article in this morning's Morningside bulletin. I'm sure you did. Read it faithfully. What does the Lord see when he looks on the heart of a baby? Well, he sees beauty. He sees innocence. He sees purity, unmarred by sin. He sees wondrous potential in each soul. And so, because of this beauty, the surpassing value of an innocent life, it was well worth the value of hiding this baby Moses for 3 months. 3 difficult months, 3 stressful months. Months where who knows, who did Pharaoh have out looking for these children, ready to enact this death by drowning in the river? How did they have to hide him? What did they have to do to keep him quiet for those 3 months? We don't know, but it seems that after 3 months, they just couldn't keep it up anymore. That the plan couldn't stay the same forever. And so his mother comes up with a different plan, another shrewd plan, but unlike Pharaoh's shrewd plan based on worldly wisdom against the will of God, this is wisdom, a shrewd plan based on what God wants. In Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch to make it waterproof. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young woman walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. I don't think this is a terrible coincidence that someone just happens to stumble upon this basket? Well, first off, I think God has a hand here. But I think the mother of Moses is also being canny here. She's making a smart decision. The Nile River, the rivers of Egypt, could be very dangerous. There's all sorts of animals there that you would not want anywhere near your baby. It could be a dreadfully dangerous place. So where would she put him? Somewhere safe. And where would someone like the daughter of Pharaoh, where would someone important, where would anyone really want to go and have a bath in the river? Well, they'd want to go somewhere safe, somewhere maybe a little bit away from the traffic of the river, where they could be hit by a passing boat, right? I think that Moses chose the spot. She put her child very carefully. She wasn't trying to just delay the same death by the river that Pharaoh intended for her child. She's really and truly trying to make the best of a bad situation, trying to save her child with her decisions. And here in the river, our final character has entered the scene, Pharaoh's daughter. Now, due to her family, due to her position, she has every reason to ignore this child. Every reason to maybe be curious and then, that's one of the Hebrews. I know exactly what Daddy said about him. He wants to kill these children. I'm not getting wrapped up in that, right? She has every reason to make it someone else's problem. Maybe just to call a guard and have them do the execution right there, do what her father wants to do. But she doesn't. Exodus 2, verse 6, when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She takes pity on him. She has compassion for this crying baby. She has love in her heart when she sees him. And this isn't in ignorance of the situation. She's able to immediately recognize that this is a Hebrew child, and soon enough, once they get the swaddling off, yep, this is indeed a Hebrew boy, one of the ones who's meant to be executed. She knows this, and she still makes her choice. She decides to take in the child, to adopt him as her own. Moses' sister runs in, offers to find a nursemaid to take care of the child, her own brother. And so Moses' birth mother gets paid to be his nurse for the early parts of his life. We don't know exactly how long that took, but for a time at least, she was able to be reunited with Moses. Pharaoh had made his decision. As we said, he made that decision again and again. He made it for the reasons we looked over, because of fear, because of a grasping of power and a fear of losing it. But his daughter wasn't bound by the same decisions her father made. She could make her own decisions. In fact, she had to make her own decisions. When we each stand before God, it will be us before him. Not you and your parents, not you and your teacher, not you and your preacher. It will be you and the choices that you made before God that you have to be accountable for. We can't just say, oh, well, someone told me to do it, and so I did what they said without thinking about it too much. We know that's not good enough for God, that I'm just following orders. That won't get you where you need to go. So while her father chose fear and death, she chose love and life. Because of the decisions of all of these women, the midwives, Moses' mother, his sister, his adopted mother, because of all of these women, Moses not only lived, but had a privileged education, set him up well in life. Again, if we were to turn back to Stephen's summary in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, we could read that Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He had the finest education, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. If any of these women had chosen differently, Moses might never have become the man that God would choose as his spokesman. He certainly might never have lived to get that far. What would have happened then? Well, God only knows. We make a big choice, a monumental choice, when we decide to be baptized, when we decide to take on Christ, when we decide to obey God. But that's certainly not the last choice we make in our Christian lives. Every day, there are decisions we're faced with, choices, whether we recognize them or not. whether we brush over them or consider them deeply. There are things that God cares about in our lives, just as he cared about the decision of the midwives, how he was paying attention to them. He's paying attention to you. He cares about you deeply and cares about what you're doing with your life. We have to keep remembering our commitment. We have to keep remembering God. After Moses did his work, brought the people to the promised land, Joshua led the tribes of Israel. And after a long life helping them take the promised land, he called them to remember God and challenged them to make a decision. We can read his final speech in Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. Now therefore, says Joshua, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We need to make our decisions today about what we're going to do tomorrow. If we wait until the last minute, if we wait until the choice, the problem is right upon us, then our vision, our perspective can be narrowed. We can be too overwhelmed as the problem seems huge and looming and so sudden and immediate and needing an urgent decision. We can't leave it till then. We need to have our hearts set before then. We need to have our foundations made before then, because your choices are important, and God cares about them, and God cares about you. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.